Late 1944. A Japanese infantryman, captured after weeks of starvation and brutal combat in the Pacific, stands before what he expects will be his execution. He's been taught since training that capture means torture, degradation, and death, that the Americans are barbaric demons who will defile his honor before killing him. Instead, he's handed soap, a towel, and directed to a shower facility with hot running water. What happened next would shatter everything he believed about his enemy and quietly transform America's Pacific strategy. For 3 years, Japanese soldiers fought to death rather than surrender, conditioned by a military culture that treated POWs as subhuman disgrace. They expected the Americans to reciprocate that cruelty. But when captured Japanese troops discovered heated showers, regular meals, medical care, and treatment that exceeded what their own army provided, the psychological impact was devastating. Not because it broke them, but because it revealed a truth their propaganda had concealed. The enemy was more civilized than the system they'd been dying for.
The year was 1943. The island was Bougainville, a brutal, rain-soaked corner of the Solomons. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decomposing coral and spent powder. Sergeant First Class Takashi Suzuki, a veteran of campaigns stretching back to the China incident, gripped the handle of his Type 89 grenade discharger. They had moved forward in the absolute darkness before dawn, their objective a narrow American outpost guarding a perimeter wire. The mission was simple: eliminate the troublesome machine gun that had pinned their platoon the previous evening. The Type 89, nicknamed the Hachi-Q by his men, was Suzuki's insurance. It was light, quiet, and carried the only high-explosive power his squad possessed. He adjusted the unique, curved base plate against the earth, sighting the mortar's simple index marks on a faint line of enemy wire roughly 250 yards ahead. The American counterfire, when it came, was not the deafening boom of naval guns, but a series of sharp, persistent cracks, the sound of the .30 caliber Browning rifle and the deep, throaty rhythm of the .50 caliber machine gun. The Hachi-Q was their only answer to the torrent of American steel. Suzuki knew its limitations. Its maximum range was only around 700 yards, and its 50mm shell was small. But it was his. It was the only support his legs, his lungs, and his courage could rely upon. He cleared his throat and whispered the first firing command. 2. Kaihatsu. Target. Fire. This single, man-portable weapon, often misnamed the knee mortar by the shocked Americans, carried an entire national doctrine on its light frame. It was the material embodiment of the Imperial Army's focus on mobility, infiltration, and the fighting spirit. Suzuki's confidence, built on years of combat where this small weapon had often been decisive, was absolute. He believed in his skill, his training, and the simple, reliable engineering of the Hachi-Q. He was about to discover, however, that the American response to their light, silent terror was a brutal industrial arithmetic that fundamentally changed the nature of fire support in the Pacific. That morning, amidst the chaos and the rain, Sergeant Suzuki faced the moment that would turn his deepest tactical conviction into a desperate fight for survival, forcing him to question the very foundation of his nation's war strategy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The world of 1943 was defined by massive industrial might clashing against deep-seated martial ideology. For the Imperial Japanese Army, engaged in a sprawling, multi-front war, the central tenet of their military philosophy, the foundation of Sergeant Suzuki's conviction, was Seishin Kyoiku, or spiritual training. This focus held that superior fighting spirit, absolute devotion to the emperor, and a willingness to endure any hardship could overcome any material disadvantage. This was not mere propaganda, it was the sincere, guiding principle for strategic planning and equipment design. The Japanese industrial base, though modern, was heavily constrained. They lacked the raw material reserves and the vast, unmolested factory infrastructure of the United States. They understood they could not win a war of raw production. They had to win a war of quality, ingenuity, and decisive action. This constraint forced the army to adopt the philosophy of light logistics and man-portability. Their vehicles were lighter, their artillery pieces were smaller, and their supplies were focused on what a soldier could carry on his back during rapid advances. The Type 89 grenade discharger was a perfect example of this doctrine. Unlike a traditional mortar, it did not use the heavy, complex base plate and large bipod required by the Americans. It used a small, curved foot plate designed for rapid deployment and simple aiming. It required only a single operator, minimizing crew exposure. While the weapon's 700-yard range seemed short, it was more than adequate for the dense jungles where engagements often took place at less than 200 yards. This weapon was not designed to engage a massive enemy in open conflict, it was designed to support the advancing infantry through rapid, high-angle fire in close terrain where heavy artillery could not follow. American intelligence officers, initially baffled by the weapon, soon realized its brilliance. It filled a critical gap between the hand grenade and the heavy mortar. It was a pocket-sized artillery piece, granting the lowest-ranking Japanese platoon commander an unprecedented level of immediate, indirect fire support. The psychological narrative that accompanied this design was crucial. Japanese soldiers were constantly reminded that their light weapons were an advantage, allowing them to outmaneuver and infiltrate the sluggish, supply-dependent Americans. This belief, passed down through the ranks, allowed Sergeant Suzuki and his peers to face the growing tide of American steel with a confidence rooted in their supposed tactical superiority. The Americans, by contrast, placed their faith in arithmetic. The Americans, specifically the U.S. Marine Corps advancing through the Pacific, viewed war through a radically different lens, the lens of industrial supremacy and logistical overmatch. Their doctrine was defined by the principle that they would bring overwhelming firepower to bear at every engagement, ensuring the safety of their infantry through steel and explosives. Every piece of equipment, from the Garand rifle to the M4 Sherman tank, was a testament to the might of the Detroit arsenals. The difference in mortar doctrine perfectly highlighted this divide. While the Japanese relied on the light, 10.5-pound Type 89, the Americans depended on the M1 81mm mortar. This weapon was a different beast entirely. It was a sectionalized weapon weighing over 136 pounds and requiring a dedicated three-man crew. Its size, however, granted it an exponential increase in power and reach. The M1 fired a projectile nearly 6 times the weight of the Japanese shell and, most crucially, possessed a maximum range of over 3,300 yards. This range disparity, more than 4.5 times the reach of the Hachikyū, was the key to the entire engagement. The American strategic intent was to keep their infantry out of range of Japanese light support weapons, relying on their own heavy mortars to dominate the indirect fire battle from safe distances. The American soldiers were implicitly promised that technology and production would safeguard them. Their psychological narrative was simple: their equipment was heavier, better protected, and could deliver more punishment from farther away. They viewed the Japanese light weapons as antiquated novelties, fit only for close-range ambushes. When they first encountered the Type 89, often misidentifying it as a true knee mortar, the initial fear was intense. But the professional assessment by American artillery experts was coldly dismissive. The weapon was an engineering concession, a desperate measure to address Japan's inability to manufacture and transport heavy ordnance. The solution to the knee mortar was not new ingenuity, but simply more of everything else. More 75mm field artillery, more M1 mortars, and more shells. The stage was set for a brutal lesson in physics, where Sergeant Suzuki's spiritual conviction would clash with the overwhelming logistical reality of the American ability to deliver an impossibly heavy projectile from an impossibly long distance. The tactical reality of the Imperial Japanese Army was built on the meticulous training of men like Sergeant Suzuki. His unit, the 3rd Platoon of the 229th Infantry Regiment, had been rigorously schooled in the unique capabilities of the Type 89 grenade discharger, the Hachikyū. The training emphasized speed, concealment, and the ability to operate independently of larger logistical trains. In the Imperial Army's field manual, the Type 89 was designated a light infantry howitzer, not a mortar. Its 50mm shell, the Type 89 grenade, was taught to be a precise, versatile weapon, capable of firing high explosive, smoke, and even illuminating rounds. The training was so specific that gunners could adjust the range by carefully regulating the amount of powder charge they placed into the base of the projectile, a necessary, but time-consuming, method. The men believed this level of detailed, personalized training compensated for the shell's small size and the weapon's short 700-yard range. They were told their weapon was an extension of the infantryman's will, light enough to be carried up cliffs and through swamps where the cumbersome American heavy weapons could never follow. This belief system was underpinned by deep institutional misrepresentations. While the Japanese army focused intensely on the qualities of their small, efficient arsenal, they systematically minimized the true quantity of American industrial output. For example, during the year 1943, the year of the Bougainville campaign, the United States produced nearly 20,000 M181mm mortars, and tens of millions of rounds of ammunition for them. By comparison, Japanese industry was able to manufacture approximately 12,000 Type 89 grenade dischargers during the entire war, a total production number the Americans eclipsed in a single year for a single, heavier, better-performing weapon. The discrepancy was logistical and material, but it was presented to the Japanese soldier as a challenge of spirit versus sloth. Sergeant Suzuki's conviction was that if they could successfully close the distance to the enemy line, say, to within 300 yards, their tactical agility and the precise, unexpected fire of the Hachi-Q would negate the American advantage in heavy firepower. He had been taught that his weapon provided the decisive, close-range shock that American heavy armor and long-range artillery could not anticipate or respond to quickly enough. He believed the Hachi-Q's 700-yard maximum was a perfectly adequate design choice, fitting the geometry of the jungle war perfectly. He was tragically unaware of the M1 mortar's capability to deliver accurate, sustained fire from 3,300 yards away, safe and untouchable, a range 4.5 times beyond his most ambitious shot. The morning attack on the American perimeter on Bougainville was not subtle, but it was sudden. Sergeant Suzuki and the 3rd Platoon reached their firing positions approximately 200 yards from the Marine lines. Suzuki whispered the adjustment for the first volley, a short, precise fire mission aimed at the enemy's main machine gun emplacement. The first 3 shells were dropped into the short barrel of the Hachi-Q and fired within seconds. The sound was a dull, low pop, followed by the almost immediate thump-thump-thump of the rounds landing and detonating near the target. The effect was good, the American machine gun went silent. This was the moment where Suzuki's training validated his belief: Japanese spirit, discipline, and the ingenious Hachi-Q had successfully neutralized American firepower at the critical short range. But the Marines' response was not the confused rifle fire or the delayed arrival of light, 75mm field guns that Suzuki had been trained to expect. The response came with an unnerving speed and a brutal, material weight that exceeded every lecture, every manual, and every expectation. Less than 60 seconds after the Japanese shells detonated, a deep, pervasive whistling started high above the canopy. This was not the quick whoosh of small-caliber Japanese artillery. This was the sound of heavy, high-trajectory projectiles descending from an impossible distance. Then the world erupted. The rounds were not aimed at the American perimeter, they were aimed precisely at Suzuki's launch point. The first rounds landed 20 yards to their left, an incredible accuracy for counter-battery fire. The detonations were enormous, tearing huge holes in the soft earth. This was the fire of the American 81mm M1 mortar. Its shell, weighing 10.5 pounds, was the weight of Suzuki's entire grenade discharger. The irony was sickening: the Japanese shell weighed 2 pounds, the American shell weighed over 10 pounds. The American projectile, delivered from over 3,000 yards away, struck with the force of a weapon 3 times its size, tearing apart the jungle cover that Suzuki had been taught would protect them. The Marines didn't have to risk a single man to engage the Hachi-Q. They simply corrected the aim of a weapon that was firing from a range 4 times greater than the Japanese mortar's maximum capacity. Suzuki, diving into the mud as the explosions hammered the air, realized the terrifying truth: the Americans didn't need ingenuity or courage to beat the Hachi-Q, they only needed the ability to produce a shell that was 5 times heavier and fire it from an unreachable distance. The brief, brutal exchange shattered Sergeant Suzuki's lifelong convictions about the nature of warfare. As the American 81mm shells continued to walk his position, forcing him and his remaining men to abandon the vital Hachi-Q and crawl backward, he grappled with the undeniable, material evidence of the vast disparity. the Imperial Army propaganda had always stressed the concept of the American soldier as soft, pampered, and dependent on excessive supplies. The reality that struck Suzuki was not cowardice, but casual abundance. The M1 mortar fire was sustained, relentless, and seemingly without limit, a volume that Japanese artillery units could not maintain for more than a few minutes. Suzuki realized that the American ability to neutralize his entire platoon's fire support in under a minute, from an untouchable distance, meant that the Japanese tactical advantage of infiltrating to within 200 yards was effectively meaningless. His light, 10.5-pound weapon was rendered obsolete by an American weapon that weighed 13 times as much, yet could still be moved and supplied with impunity. This was the ultimate betrayal of the Seishin Kyoika doctrine. No amount of superior spirit could overcome the physics of a shell delivered with 400% greater range and 500% greater mass. Suzuki's experience was echoed throughout the Pacific. In one stark assessment, a captured Japanese officer noted the shocking contrast between his unit, which carried 1 day of rice and a single drum of 60mm mortar ammunition, and the American supply dumps. They had enough of everything. They left full rations and ammunition piled up in the mud because they brought so much more. The final, crushing realization for Suzuki was that the Japanese strategic focus on the close fight was a self-fulfilling prophecy of defeat. By designing their weapons for light logistics and short ranges, they had surrendered the entire indirect fire battle to the Americans. The vast difference between the Hachikyu's 700-yard reach and the M1's 3,300-yard capability meant that every Japanese support unit was always operating in the immediate kill zone of the heavier American weapons, while the American gunners were safe behind an industrial firewall. The Battle of Bougainville solidified a lesson for the entire Imperial Army. The sheer, devastating weight of American industrial output had fundamentally broken the Japanese military doctrine of spirit over matter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical failure on Bougainville was not an isolated incident, it was a microcosm of the larger, industrial defeat that played out across the Pacific Islands from 1944 onward. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, including Sergeant Suzuki, the experience initiated a profound psychological process, the shift from fanatical confidence to betrayed resignation. This change was directly reflected in field reports and captured documents. Japanese military communications began to focus less on the heroic employment of light weapons and more on the overwhelming necessity of avoiding American heavy fire entirely. The men understood that their Type 89 grenade discharger, their Hachikyu, was not a tactical advantage but a vulnerability signal. Firing it immediately invited the devastating, long-range response of the American 81mm mortars. The maximum range of 700 yards that had once seemed adequate now felt like a death trap, ensuring that every time they opened fire, they were well within the impact zone of the American counter-barrage. The realization fostered an intense sense of abandonment. Japanese soldiers had been trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment over the crude American mass-produced items. To discover that the crude, heavy American weapon could deliver a shell 5 times heavier from a distance 4.5 times greater fundamentally undermined the command structure's credibility. This crisis of faith manifested in increased desertion rates and a decline in the aggressive, infiltration tactics that had defined early Japanese successes. Why risk a dangerous advance to within a mere 200 yards of the enemy when the enemy's support fire could reach you from 3,000? The equation of risk versus reward had shifted disastrously. The short-range, man-portable doctrine, born of logistical necessity, had become a strategic liability, turning the fighting spirit into a grim exercise in endurance rather than victory. This material evidence, the sheer, quantifiable difference between a 2-pound shell and a 10.5-pound shell, became the subject of grim jokes and fatalistic philosophy among the Japanese ranks. The American forces, though successful in breaking the Japanese fire support doctrine, also learned critical, if less painful, lessons from the encounter with the Type 89. The Marines and Army infantry recognized the unique psychological terror created by a weapon that offered no auditory warning. The silence of the incoming 50mm shell and its sudden, close detonation forced American units to adjust their perimeter security and defensive posture. They moved beyond merely relying on the overwhelming range of the 81mm mortar for counter-battery fire. New tactics emphasized the need for constant, forward observation and the liberal use of automatic weapons fire into suspected Japanese mortar positions, even if those positions were within what was considered the safe margin of the perimeter. The Americans realized that while their industrial might gave them strategic dominance, the Japanese, operating in the tight, chaotic geography of the islands, still held the tactical initiative in close quarters. The Type 89 forced the Americans to respect the Japanese infantry's ability to conduct rapid, decentralized fire missions. Furthermore, the captured Type 89 grenade dischargers were analyzed meticulously. Their simple, elegant design, using a spigot rather than a cup to propel the projectile, was praised by American ordnance experts. They understood that the weapon was a genius solution to a poor logistical situation. The Americans never adopted the design, as their supply chain was built around heavier, more powerful weapons like the 60mm and 81mm mortars, but the encounter solidified the concept that every piece of enemy equipment must be taken seriously, regardless of its perceived technological inferiority. The knee mortar became a legendary, fearful symbol within the American ranks, not for its power, but for the ruthless ingenuity it represented and the psychological impact of its silent delivery. It forced the world's most materially rich army to constantly look over its shoulder, proving that even a technically obsolete weapon, when deployed under a strict doctrine of infiltration, could challenge overwhelming superiority. The true legacy of the Type 89 grenade discharger and the American 81mm mortar clash is found not in battlefield statistics, but in the post-war industrial output of both nations. Following the surrender in 1945, the fundamental philosophical differences regarding military equipment design became clear. The United States continued to refine its doctrine of heavy, long-range fire support, prioritizing the safety of its infantry through material superiority. Their post-war arsenal maintained powerful, crew-served mortars and artillery, capable of dominating the landscape from untouchable distances. Japan, defeated and occupied, saw its military industry dismantled. However, the operational lesson, the genius of the light, man-portable weapon, was a historical footnote that would later influence global arms design. The Type 89, though never copied directly, represents a peak example of a weapon designed around logistical scarcity and terrain constraints. It showed the world that a 10.5-pound weapon could perform the mission of a short-range howitzer. The Soviet Union and later other nations engaged in limited wars of maneuver would study this principle, seeking to arm their infantry with light, effective support fire without demanding massive logistical trains. Sergeant Suzuki, if he survived, carried the crushing weight of the contrast between his 2-pound shell and the American 10.5-pound shell. It was the most vivid, tangible lesson in the cost of industrial warfare. The Imperial Army's faith in spiritual power could never overcome the immutable law of kinetic energy, which demanded that the heavier, faster shell, delivered from the greater distance, would always win the indirect fire battle. This quiet weapon, the Hachi-Q, thus stands as a monument to one nation's brilliant engineering constraint and another nation's devastating industrial freedom. For the American mortar crews, the Type 89 became an object lesson in their own strategic value. The ability of the 81mm mortar crew to rapidly deliver 3,300-yard counter-battery fire against the Japanese weapon operating at 700 yards was not a matter of superior crew training, it was a matter of raw, technological physics backed by an infinite supply chain. The typical American M1 mortar section could fire dozens of rounds in the time it took the Japanese to prepare a second, manually charged volley. The American advantage was not just range, it was sustained rate of fire. The crew could continue to drop the heavy 10.5-pound shells into the barrel, round after round, with minimal fatigue, while the Japanese gunner had to crouch, measure his powder, and meticulously reset his charge. This mechanical, industrial superiority was the true psychological hammer against the Japanese doctrine of spiritual resolve. The knowledge that they could keep firing long after the enemy was silent reinforced the American soldiers' belief in the protective power of their industrial complex. One American infantry officer, writing home from Okinawa in 1945, stated simply that the Japanese fought well, but their weapons ran out of reach and their courage ran out of metal. This observation perfectly encapsulated the material truth. The Japanese courage was enormous, but it was unsupported by the necessary metal to deliver decisive, long-range fire. The American 81mm mortar, with its massive range and endless supply, represented the ultimate, undeniable victory of the assembly line over the infantryman's will. In reflection, the story of the Type 89 and the M181mm mortar is a narrative of two civilizations approaching the problem of warfare with completely incompatible methods. The Japanese solution was vertical, deepening the skill, spirit, and ingenuity of the individual soldier to compensate for material lack. The American solution was horizontal, spreading overwhelming material power across the battlefield to minimize the cost to the individual soldier. Sergeant Suzuki's dedication to the 700-yard range of his Hachi-Q was an act of profound patriotism and commitment to his training. The American response, the simple, industrial act of firing a 10.5-pound shell from 3,300 yards away, was not an act of individual heroism, but an expression of national destiny. The irony persists. The genius of Japanese engineering produced one of the most operationally effective light infantry weapons of the war, yet its very existence was the final, tragic proof of a fatally flawed national strategy. The Type 89's silence and mobility could not save it from the deafening, impersonal arithmetic of American industrial weight. The war in the Pacific, in its truest, most material sense, was decided by the difference between a 2-pound shell and a 10.5-pound shell, and the insurmountable gulf between 700 yards and 3,300 yards. This was the definitive lesson learned in the wet, dark jungle of Bougainville and every island that followed. The final phase of the conflict, leading into the decisive battles for the Japanese home islands, saw the institutional breakdown of the Imperial Army's traditional fire support doctrine. Sergeant Suzuki's bitter revelation on Bougainville, that the Type 89's 700-yard range was merely a target marker for the American 81mm mortar operating at 3,300 yards, was replicated everywhere. Japanese field commanders, realizing the suicidal nature of the close-range engagements, began to deliberately withhold their light support weapons. The Hachi-Q became a weapon of last resort, to be used only in the most desperate of night counterattacks where the lack of visible tracers might delay the crushing American response. This strategic silence further undermined the infantry's morale, stripping them of the only organic artillery they possessed. The American forces, observing this shift, grew bolder. They learned to interpret the absence of Japanese counterfire not as a sign of successful infiltration, but as confirmation of their own overwhelming firepower superiority. The American gunners and forward observers, confident in their 3,300-yard reach, adjusted their fire lines further forward, effectively choking off Japanese supply routes and assembly areas before the infantry even engaged. The simple, powerful physics of the American 10.5-pound shell had effectively neutered the Japanese fighting spirit by removing its material backing. The industrial disparity was now not just a matter of logistics, it was a matter of operational capacity, dictating who could fire, when they could fire, and most importantly, from where. The attempt by Japanese engineers to address this overwhelming disparity came too late and too little. Recognizing the vulnerability of the 50mm grenade, they attempted to field heavier infantry support weapons, such as the Type 99 81mm mortar. This weapon, which weighed nearly 50 pounds, was a direct attempt to match the American caliber and reach. However, due to severe wartime material shortages and the constant Allied submarine blockade that choked off raw resources, production of the Type 99 was minimal. The vast majority of Japanese infantry continued to rely on the outdated Type 97 90mm grenade discharger or the ubiquitous Type 89. By the time of the battles for Iwo Jima in 1945, American heavy mortars and artillery were so abundant that they fired continuous barrages that literally reshaped the terrain. In one instance, a Marine unit on Iwo Jima reported receiving more friendly 81mm mortar support in a single hour than Japanese infantry received in the entire Bougainville campaign. The contrast was a final, undeniable testament to the failure of the Japanese industrial philosophy. While Sergeant Suzuki had placed his faith in the clever engineering of a 10.5-pound weapon, the Americans simply rolled out truckloads of their own, equally clever, but overwhelmingly heavier, weapons. The war had stopped being a contest of tactical maneuvers and had become a simple measurement of tonnage and trajectory. The long-term psychological impact on the veterans who survived was profound. For American soldiers, the experience confirmed a deep-seated belief in the superiority of American technology and the virtue of overwhelming force. The knee mortar became a campfire story, a colorful but ultimately minor threat overcome by superior engineering and logistics. For Japanese veterans, the memory of the Hachikyu's inadequacy fueled a lasting skepticism about their former leadership's capacity to lead. Many veterans recalled the fervent propaganda praising their light equipment and later juxtaposed it with the sickening sound of the massive American 81mm shells destroying their positions. This disconnect contributed to the post-war rejection of the militaristic ideology that had prioritized Seishin Kyoiku over industrial reality. The psychological shift was permanent, the realization that the 2-pound shell was a lie, and the 10.5-pound shell was the ultimate truth. The sacrifice of Japanese soldiers was immense, but it was rendered materially meaningless by a logistical machine that could generate 4 times the destructive power from 4 times the safety. The failure of the 700-yard mortar against the 3,300-yard mortar became a quiet, enduring symbol of the war's true cost. The technological and doctrinal lessons learned by the United States during the Pacific War were immediately incorporated into the post-war military apparatus. The overwhelming success of the 81mm mortar was a primary factor in the continued focus on long-range, indirect fire support for infantry. Post-war mortar systems, such as the American M29 81mm, maintained or increased the range and precision achieved by the M1. The fundamental principle was solidified: infantry support must outrange the enemy's support. This emphasis on range and volume, born from the necessity of countering the ingenious, but ultimately limited, Type 89, became the standard for the decades that followed. The Type 89 itself faded into history as a fascinating example of engineering under duress, a weapon that achieved brilliance within its limitations but was ultimately defeated by an entirely different philosophy of war. Its short barrel and light weight were the very features that sentenced it to obsolescence when faced with an enemy that could afford to build bigger, heavier, and more complex. The contrast between the Japanese Type 89 and the American M1 81mm is, in essence, a perfect case study in the power of total war industrialization to dictate the terms of victory. In the quiet decades following the war, the Type 89 sometimes appeared in unexpected places, in small-scale conflicts and in the arsenals of emerging nations who needed simple, cheap support fire. Yet, its story always carried the same cautionary tale. It was a weapon of scarcity, designed for a force that could not sustain heavy logistics. Its operational use was a constant reminder of the economic and industrial failures of the nation that created it. The American 81mm, by contrast, became a ubiquitous tool of stability and intervention, a weapon of abundance and projection, found wherever American military power was deployed. The heavy, sectionalized mortar, once viewed as cumbersome, became the gold standard, its 3,300-yard reach a non-negotiable requirement. Sergeant Suzuki's Hachikyu, while capable of firing its 2-pound shell with pinpoint accuracy at 300 yards, could never break the industrial shield of the enemy. The enduring, chilling lesson of the Pacific battlefield remains: the finest fighting spirit and the cleverest tactical design will inevitably be crushed by the sheer, unyielding weight of superior material science and logistics. The ultimate irony of the conflict, exemplified by the clash of these two weapons, is that the Japanese had correctly identified the importance of close-range, decentralized fire support, a doctrine that would later become a key element of modern infantry combat. However, their industrial weakness forced them to pursue this doctrine with a weapon that was simply too small and too short-range to survive the counterfire of a peer adversary. The M1 81mm mortar did not just defeat the Hachikyu, it fundamentally negated the entire tactical school that created it, proving that even progressive doctrine requires the backing of overwhelming material power to succeed. Sergeant Suzuki, having risked his life to bring his light weapon within 700 yards of the enemy, faced a force that could destroy him from 5 times that distance. He and his comrades were casualties of a war fought not just on the ground, but in the factories and shipping lanes of the world. The silence of the abandoned Hachikyū on the muddy slopes of Bougainville spoke louder than any shell, delivering the final, crushing verdict of industrial warfare. The institutional failure represented by the Type 89 was not restricted to the army, it permeated the entire Japanese war effort. The Imperial Navy, too, built its fleet on the fallacy of the singular, decisive weapon, culminating in the enormous Yamato-class battleships which, like the small mortar, were technologically superb but strategically obsolete. Just as Sergeant Suzuki's Hachikyū was defeated by the abundant, long-range fire of the 81mm mortar, the battleship Yamato was destroyed by the sheer, unending volume of American carrier aircraft. The Japanese doctrine prioritized deep, complex engineering and heavy armor for one-of-a-kind projects. The Americans prioritized rapid, simplified production for millions of modular components, from the 20mm machine cannon on a Hellcat to the standard 81mm mortar shell. This difference in philosophy was not merely a matter of scale, it was a fundamental disagreement on the nature of modern warfare. The Japanese clung to the pre-war idea that the decisive battle would be won by the most powerful individual unit. The Americans proved that the war was won by the most capable industrial system. The Type 89, with its 700-yard range, and the Yamato, with its 18-inch guns, were both victims of the same logistical and industrial chokehold, defeated by adversaries who focused on sustained, overwhelming volume rather than singular, specialized power. A closer examination of the Type 89's projectile reveals a final, critical layer of vulnerability. The 50mm grenade, weighing approximately 2 pounds, had a thin casing designed for maximum fragmentation. While devastating to unarmored infantry at close range, it was highly susceptible to deflection and lacked the penetrating power or explosive force required to consistently suppress fortified positions, the very positions the infantry often relied on the support weapon to clear. By contrast, the American 81mm mortar fired a heavier, thicker-cased projectile, ensuring greater stability in flight and a larger lethal radius upon impact. Furthermore, the Japanese supply chain was so brittle that, by the later stages of the war, the quality control on the grenades declined precipitously, leading to an increasing number of duds and premature detonations. The American 10.5-pound shells, rolling off assembly lines across the continental United States, maintained consistently high quality, ensuring that every round fired from 3,300 yards away delivered its full intended destructive force. This systemic reliability, often taken for granted by the American soldier, was the ultimate material advantage. It meant that every soldier could trust the tools of his trade, while Sergeant Suzuki and his men increasingly had to doubt the efficacy and safety of the very shells they fired from their Hachikyū. The legacy of the knee mortar also impacted post-war intelligence and training across the globe. After analyzing captured weapons, military academies in Western nations recognized the Type 89 not as an antique, but as a masterpiece of asymmetrical warfare, a concept that would define many future conflicts. It demonstrated that an inexpensive, easily concealed weapon could effectively counter the psychological certainty of a technologically superior force, forcing them to expend vast resources on countermeasures. The lessons learned about the Type 89's silent delivery and rapid displacement led to changes in infantry patrols and fire and maneuver drills in many armies. While the Americans ultimately countered it with the overwhelming force of the 81mm mortar, the initial fear and confusion generated by the Japanese weapon proved that material weakness, when coupled with clever tactical doctrine, could be weaponized. The psychological cost to the U.S. Marines in the early island campaigns was measurable, forcing them to adapt their reliance on heavy fire support to incorporate vigilance against this small, silent threat. The 700-yard range was tactically limited, but the psychological impact was limitless. The comparison also highlights the critical difference in logistical philosophy during the war. The American military operated under a principle of push logistics. They pushed massive amounts of supplies, ammunition, and equipment far beyond the immediate front lines, creating a deep reserve that absorbed any losses. The Japanese military, constrained by industry and shipping, operated under a pull logistics model. Units had to pull meter supplies from increasingly distant and vulnerable depots, operating almost always at the edge of starvation and ammunition depletion. The 81mm mortar, heavy and powerful, required and benefited from this push system. Its crews knew that when they needed sustained fire, the 10.5-pound shells would arrive by the thousands. The Type 89, light and fragile, was a product of the pull system. Its scarcity meant that every 2-pound shell was a precious, almost irreplaceable commodity. This disparity meant the Americans could afford to fire their 81mm mortars for suppression, harassment, and interdiction, while Sergeant Suzuki's use of the Hachi-Q was restricted purely to the immediate, desperate support of an attacking infantry squad, a strategic limitation built directly into the weight and range of his weapon. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, the fate of the Japanese infantry was sealed long before the invasion of Okinawa in 1945. It was sealed in the design specifications of the Type 89 grenade discharger in 1929 and the M1 81mm mortar in 1928. The specifications of the Hachi-Q, its 700-yard range and 2-pound shell, were an honest reflection of what the nation could sustain. The specifications of the M1, its 3,300-yard range and 10.5-pound shell, were an honest reflection of what the nation could afford to waste. The war was a contest between sufficiency and surplus, between ingenuity born of scarcity and dominance born of industry. No amount of training, courage, or spiritual resolve could bridge the gap between those two numbers. The ultimate, bitter lesson for Sergeant Suzuki and his comrades was that in the modern industrial era, physics and finance would always trump fervor. The memory of the Type 89 grenade discharger persists today as a potent symbol of a brilliant, doomed design. It remains a historical testament to the individual soldier's desperate struggle against overwhelming industrial fate. The American 81mm mortar, now modernized but still operating on the same principles of range and volume, continues its legacy as the quiet backbone of infantry support. The two weapons, separated by a mere 2,600 yards of effective range, define two opposing approaches to warfare that clashed violently in the Jungle Islands. Sergeant Suzuki's final, desperate act was not to aim his Hachi-Q at the enemy, but to realize that his nation had aimed its entire war effort at the wrong target. The true target was not the American soldier, but the American factory, and that battle had been lost years before the first shell of the Type 89 was ever fired in anger across the Pacific. The economic underpinnings of the material failure are illuminated by the cost per kill ratio, a cold metric that starkly reveals the efficiency divide. The Japanese Type 89, while cheap to manufacture individually, became exorbitantly expensive in operational terms because of its 700-yard range limitation. Every time a Japanese unit successfully engaged a target with the 2-pound shell, it immediately exposed itself to overwhelming American counterfire, often resulting in the loss of the entire 3-man squad. The human cost alone made the weapon financially prohibitive. The American 81mm mortar, though initially more expensive to produce due to its complexity and heavy materials, provided exceptional cost efficiency in combat. The ability to engage the enemy and neutralize targets from over 3,300 yards meant the crew was rarely exposed to direct counterfire, preserving not only lives but also the valuable material of the weapon itself. Furthermore, the American 10.5-pound shell delivered a high explosive yield that could consistently eliminate enemy positions with fewer rounds, minimizing the amount of ammunition required per successful engagement. The Japanese, forced to use their tiny 2-pound shells in rapid, concentrated bursts to achieve the same effect, consumed their meager ammunition reserves at an unsustainable rate. The Type 89, therefore, was not merely a tactical weapon, it was a devastating economic liability. Its short range was the final, fatal price paid for an industrial base that could not afford to manufacture a shell heavy enough, or a delivery system powerful enough, to compete in the indirect fire battle. The most lasting, non-material impact of this weapon disparity was the erosion of trust between the Japanese infantry and their high command. Sergeant Suzuki and his peers had repeatedly been told that the ingenuity and portability of the Hachi-Q were signs of Japanese technical superiority. When the crushing reality of the American 81mm counterfire demonstrated that the Type 89 was instead a symbol of industrial deprivation and strategic miscalculation, the relationship of trust dissolved. Soldiers realized they were being asked to trade their lives not for victory, but to compensate for the fundamental failings of their national industry. This loss of faith manifested in a profound sense of betrayal, a psychological state noted consistently by American intelligence officers interrogating captured Japanese personnel in the later stages of the war. They frequently expressed shock at the casual abundance of American supplies and the sheer, unending volume of the American artillery response, a sight that utterly contradicted the propaganda they had been fed. The 700-yard range of the Hachikyū became a mental boundary, symbolizing the line where the soldier's courage ended and the system's lies began. Ultimately, the Type 89 grenade discharger is a historical artifact that defines not just a tactical fight, but the complete collapse of a national narrative, proving that in modern warfare, the soldier's spirit, however great, cannot indefinitely endure the truth delivered by a 10.5-pound shell traveling 3,300 yards. Thank you for watching. For more tailored historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.